The silent ghost of Hope Colony hadn't spoken in 10 years. He lived as a myth among the natives, haunted by the outbreak that took everything from him. Then an alien girl appeared at his shelter, tears streaming down her face. "Please, mighty human. My mother was taken by enemies." Her plea would force him to choose between his isolation and a dangerous new purpose. Mark moved through the ruins of Hope Colony. His boots scraped against twisted metal and shattered glass. The air tasted of rust and old death. He knew every collapsed corridor, every buckled doorframe. The natives called him a myth, a story to scare children into obedience. Their fear was a tool he never asked for but used anyway. His grief was the only real thing left in this place. He worked with methodical precision, scavenging for salvageable circuit boards, checking perimeter traps for game, maintaining the solar arrays that powered his minimal existence. His shelter was a reinforced storage unit, its walls lined with tools, medical supplies, and stacked rations. There were no comforts, no decorations, only the instruments of survival, each with a purpose, each with a place. The weather on Xantos was unkind. Acid rains pitted the metal around him. Sandstorms scoured paint from the few standing walls. The wind carried a constant low hum, a sound that had replaced human conversation a decade ago. He adapted to the harshness, learned its patterns. His solitude was a weight he carried like his pack, a familiar burden measured in silent days and star-filled nights. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong, not the scrape of a six-legged wind scurrier, not the cry of a duskhawk. A voice, small and desperate, a child's voice cutting through the wind like a shard of glass. He froze. His hand went to the knife at his belt. 10 years of instinct screamed at him to retreat, to vanish into the shadows where myths belong. But the sound came again, closer this time, a sob raw with fear. The colony's silence had been absolute since the outbreak. A pathogen engineered for rapid deployment in confined spaces. It moved through the ventilation, through the water recyclers. People fell in corridors, at workstations, in their beds. The medical bay became a tomb. He'd watched his team die, held his commanding officer as she choked on blood-flecked foam, found his wife and daughter in their quarters, their hands still clasped together. He was the only one who didn't get sick, immune for reasons the dying doctors couldn't explain. He buried them all. Every single one. Then he sealed the colony and walked into the wilderness, a ghost carrying a dead world on his shoulders. The child's voice called out again. Closer now, pleading in broken universal. He stood in the shadow of a broken communications tower, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ghost was about to be seen. The ghost was about to become real. The girl stood at the edge of his marked perimeter. Her small frame trembled against the harsh wind that swept across the metal plane. Dirt streaked her blue-tinged cheeks where tears had carved clean lines through the grime. Her tunic was torn at the shoulder, the fabric shredded by thorns or claws. She shouldn't be here. This was his ground, his silence. His alone for 10 years, she called out again, her voice thin and cracking. She used the old trade dialect, the one humans had taught the river tribes before the fall. She called him the names he'd heard whispered at the edge of his hearing for a decade. The silent one, the ghost of the metal place. She wasn't telling a story. She was pleading with it to be real. Mark watched from the deep shadow of a collapsed habitation module. His hand rested on the cold metal of his rifle stock. Every instinct, every lesson learned through years of survival, told him to melt back into the ruins, to let the wind and the distance swallow her voice. She was a complication, a variable, a risk. Her words carried on the wind, each one a hammer striking the wall he'd built. She spoke of raiders from the north, of a sudden ambush at dawn, of her mother, a healer, dragged away by scaled hands. She spoke of the Scalers, a tribe that kept to the mountains, feared for their ruthlessness and their strange rituals. She was alone. Her village was days away. The myth of the ghost was her only chance. Her sobs were the worst part. It was a sound he knew, the ragged, helpless sound of loss. He'd heard it echoing through the colony corridors before the silence fell. He'd made that sound himself, kneeling in the medical bay holding his daughter's cold hand. It was a sound that bypassed strategy, that ignored the calculated risk of contact. He understood her desperate situation now. The Scalers had taken her mother not for ransom or revenge, but for her knowledge. Their chieftain was dying. Fever. Chills. A sickness the tribe's own healers couldn't cure. They needed a miracle, They took the only person who might provide one, dragging her north to their mountain caves to save a life at the point of a spear. The girl fell silent, her energy spent. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. She had thrown her hope at a ghost story. Her need was a door swinging open in the ruins of his world. Mark stood at the threshold, the weight of a decade pressing on one side, the memory of a child's sob pulling on the other. The silence was breaking. He had to choose which side of the door to stand on. That name was a weight he refused to carry, a relic from a dead world. He hadn't spoken it aloud since the last door sealed on Hope Colony. To say it now would be an admission, a confession that he was still a man beneath the grit and silence, that the ghost was just a story he let them tell. The girl, Aya, looked up at him. Her wide eyes held no fear, only a raw, desperate hope that cut deeper than any weapon. She saw the myth made flesh. A legend stepped from the fireside stories. He saw a reflection of everything he'd failed to protect. A child alone begging for a miracle he knew didn't exist. His wife, Sarah, lived in the quiet corners of his mind. He could still see the way she pushed a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a small, precise motion he'd watched 1,000 times. Their daughter, Eliza, was a brighter, sharper ghost. Her laughter echoed in empty corridors only he could hear. Their memories were a wall he'd built stone by stone over 10 long years. A barrier between himself and the living, a monument to his failure. Aya's plea was a chisel strike against that wall. Each sob, each ragged breath chipped at the mortar holding it together. She wasn't asking for a soldier. She was asking for a person. The outbreak that took them was a swift, clinical horror. It didn't rage. It simply arrived. The air recyclers whispered it through the colony while people slept. They called it the gray sleep. One day a cough, the next a fever that spiked through the roof, then the bloody foam at the mouth. The silence. He found Sarah in their quarters. She was curled on her side on the sleeping platform, one hand stretched out toward the edge as if reaching for something, or someone. Eliza was in the next room, tucked into her bunk with her favorite stuffed rover beast clutched to her chest. They looked like they were sleeping. The only wrong thing was the stillness, the absolute perfect stillness. He was the only one who didn't get sick. The doctors, dying at their stations, called it a statistical anomaly. He called it a curse. He buried them in the thin soil beyond the perimeter lights. He said no words. There were no words left. The silence that followed was the loudest sound he'd ever known. It had been his companion for a decade. His shield. Now this child's tears were breaking it. She stood shivering before him, her fate balanced on his next breath. The ghost had to choose. Remain a story or become a man again. His throat was dry, his voice a rusty instrument long unused. The air felt thick. He looked at Aya, at the terrified hope in her eyes, and the first word in 10 years broke from him. It was a whisper, rough and unfamiliar. My name is Mark. The words hung in the air between them, foreign and heavy on his tongue. The ghost had a name. The wall had its first crack. The choice was binary. Absolute. Stay in the silence he had carved from a decade of loss, or step back into the noise and danger of other lives. His isolation was a shield. Tested, proven. It kept the world out and his ghosts in. It was a simple equation with a known outcome. Solitude equaled survival. Intervention meant rewriting the equation with unknown variables. Risk. Contact. The terrifying possibility of reigniting the very thing that scorched his world clean. He looked at Aya, the dirt on her face, the thinness of her arms. She was a child standing where a child shouldn't be, her future hanging by a thread. She mirrored the future his own daughter lost. The same age, maybe. The same desperate need for protection he had failed to provide. The ethical dilemma was a knife edge. Preserve the one life he knew was safe, his own, or gamble it to preserve another, to be the shield for someone else. His military training engaged, a cold analytical engine kicking to life after years of disuse. Threat assessment. The scalers were numerous, hostile, and held the terrain advantage. Their mountain caves were a natural fortress. Terrain analysis. The journey north was through uncharted wilds, riddled with indigenous predators and toxic flora. Objective. Extract one high-value individual from a fortified enemy position with a non-combatant in tow. The numbers scrolled behind his eyes. Probability of successful extraction low.
Probability of engagement high.
Probability of casualty extreme. Every tactical calculation, every strategic forecast pointed to a single, grim outcome, failure or death. But a different calculation was running underneath. A deeper one. It didn't use numbers or maps. It measured the weight of a child's hand in his. It calculated the cost of a 10th year of silence against the raw terror in a young girl's eyes. It was the math of simple humanity, and its answer was clear. For 10 years his choice had been absolute. His grief was a planet-sized weight too immense to share. It was a private tomb he was condemned to live inside, and beneath that was the deeper, colder fear, the gray sleep. He was a carrier. The doctors had suspected it, whispering theories with their dying breaths. His immunity was a curse. He was a walking reservoir of the very pathogen that had killed everyone he loved. To make contact was to risk being the spark for another wildfire. To help was to potentially kill. That burden was too great for any one person to carry. It was easier, safer for everyone to be a ghost. He looked from the trembling girl to his rifle leaning against the shelter wall. The polished stock. The clean bore. A tool for killing, or for protecting. The calculations warred for a final second. The tactical assessment screamed retreat. The human calculation demanded advance. His hand closed around the rifle's familiar grip. The cold metal was a decision made solid. The weight of it was an answer. The ghost was going to war. They moved north. The path was a traverse through a graveyard of two worlds. To their left lay the skeletal remains of Hope Colony, twisted metal reaching for a sky that no longer held rescue ships. To their right, the wilds of Xantos stretched out, a landscape of jagged rock and strange, pulsing flora that had begun reclaiming the human scars. They walked the seam between a dead past and a lethal present. The terrain was openly hostile. The ground was littered with sharp metal shards and brittle, glass-like rocks that cracked underfoot. Strange vines with thorns like needles snaked across their path. Aya knew the general direction, pointing out landmarks her people used for trade routes. A twisted spire of black rock, a dry riverbed choked with blue sand. But her knowledge was a child's memory of stories, not a scout's practiced topography. She knew the names of places, not their dangers. Mark's senses, dulled by a decade of predictable solitude, sharpened with every step. The routine of his survival had been a closed loop: hunt, scavenge, maintain. Now the loop was broken, and every shadow held a potential threat. His eyes scanned constantly, not for game, but for movement. A shift in the pattern of the wind-blown grass. A flicker in the corner of his vision. His ears strained past the wind, listening for the scrape of a claw on stone, the snap of a twig under a weight that wasn't theirs. He was relearning the world in real time, his body remembering the old rhythms of patrol and perimeter watch. The air grew colder as they climbed, biting through his worn jacket. The flora changed, becoming stranger and more menacing. Trees with bark like overlapping scales wept a sticky, sap-like substance. Fungus clusters glowed with a faint greenish light, their sweet, rotten smell cloying in the thin air. It was a world that did not want them there. Aya pointed ahead, her small hand trembling slightly. A distant mountain range clawed at the sky, its peaks shrouded in grim gray clouds. The stone was a dark volcanic black streaked with veins of angry red mineral. "Their caves are there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Scalers." The natives called him the Silent Ghost for a reason. He was the one who lived where nothing could, the man who walked out of the plague-stricken colony when thousands fell, the myth who survived alone in the metal ruins for 10 cycles, never speaking, never trading, never appearing except as a fleeting shadow on the edge of a firelight tale. His complete withdrawal from their world, his impossible survival against the colony's end and the planet's wrath, built a mythos he never intended. He was a story they told to explain the unexplainable, a legend of solitude and loss. Now that legend was walking a small, frightened girl toward the storm gathering on the mountain. He adjusted the rifle on his shoulder, the weight a familiar anchor in the strangeness. The ghost and the girl moved forward into the teeth of the coming tempest. A river blocked their path. It was wider than it looked on the approach, the water a churning gray-green rush fed by mountain snowmelt. The sound was a constant low roar that filled the air. The cold coming off it was a physical presence, raising goosebumps on their skin. The only way across was a single fallen log, an old giant of the forest that had toppled in some long-ago storm. Its bark was long gone, the naked wood underneath slick with a coat of bright green moss and a sheen of recent rain. It looked rotten in places, a treacherous bridge over water that promised a hard, cold death. Aya stopped at the bank. Her small hands clenched at her sides. The fear on her face was plain, a tightness around her eyes and mouth. She looked from the slippery log to the violent water below, then back to Mark. She didn't need to say anything. The current below would sweep her away in a second, dashing her against the rocks. The crossing was a test she hadn't expected. Mark went first. He didn't ask. He just moved. He stepped onto the log, his boots finding purchase on the slimy surface. The wood groaned under his weight, a soft, ominous sound beneath the river's roar. He tested each step, shifting his weight slowly, feeling for soft spots. The center of the log bowed slightly. He made it to the middle, a precarious balance point over the deepest, fastest part of the current. He turned back to face her. He held out his hand. It was a simple, wordless offer. His palm was calloused and scarred, a map of a decade of survival. It was a gesture he hadn't made in 10 years. An offer of connection, an offer of trust. It felt strangely foreign. His arm extended into the space between isolation and another person. Aya looked from his face to his hand. Her own fear was a live thing, but her trust was stronger. She reached out and took it. Her small, cool hand was swallowed by his grip. It was a fragile link, a circuit closing after a decade of being open. She stepped onto the log, her movements hesitant and careful. Halfway across, her foot slipped. The moss betrayed her, her boot sliding out from under her with a sudden sickening lurch. She cried out, a short, sharp sound lost in the river's noise. Her weight pulled against his arm, her body tilting toward the hungry water below. The current yawned beneath her, a churning drop into cold oblivion. Mark's reflexes were instantaneous. They were not the slow, considered movements of a solitary man, but the honed, muscle-deep reactions of a soldier and a survivor. His grip on her hand locked into an iron clamp. His other arm snapped out, his hand closing around her upper arm. He didn't pull her up so much as he anchored her, becoming a fixed point in her sudden fall. He shifted his own weight, counterbalancing her slide, his boots digging into the soft wood. The log shuddered but held. He pulled her back onto the center of the log, her body colliding with his legs. For a second, they both stood still, breathing hard, the adrenaline a sharp taste in the air. They reached the other side a minute later. Aya's knees were shaking as her feet touched solid ground. She let go of his hand, her own fingers trembling. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, her breath coming in quick gasps. He just gave a single, slow nod. No words were needed. The simple act, the offer of a hand and the swift, sure response to danger, had sealed their understanding more firmly than any promise could. The trust was a solid thing between them now. He adjusted the strap of his rifle and turned to face the north. The path ahead was still long. Dusk fell and the forest changed its voice. The chittering of the day creatures, the rustle of small things in the undergrowth, the distant calls of hunting birds, it all ceased. A heavy quiet descended, broken only by the sigh of wind through the strange, scale-like leaves overhead. It was the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. Mark stopped walking. Aya froze beside him, her small hand instinctively reaching for the edge of his coat. Then new sounds emerged. Not from above, but from the ground. A heavy, rhythmic crunch. Not the snap of a twig, but the deep, deliberate compression of soil and stone under immense weight. It was slow, purposeful. Each step was a distinct, separate event that vibrated through the soles of their boots. A low growl followed. Not a high-pitched snarl, but a deep, rumbling frequency that seemed to originate in their own chests. It was the sound of something very large and very displeased. Mark's reaction was a single, fluid motion. His left arm swept out, pushing Aya behind him and toward the cover of a thick, moss-covered boulder. His right hand brought the rifle up to his shoulder, the stock fitting against his cheek with the familiarity of an old habit. His finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger. His eyes scanned the deepening shadows between the trees, tracking the sound. The colony database, a fragment of knowledge he'd kept operational for a decade, supplied the name. Thunderfoot, a massive territorial omnivore. Armored hide, known for its relentless bulldozing charges. Direct confrontation was a last resort, a stupid one. Aya pressed against the cold stone, her whisper barely audible. Thunderfoot. The name was a folk tale to her people, a story of a mountain spirit that shook the earth. Now it was a reality moving toward them in the dark. It was still hidden by the thick vegetation, a shadow among shadows. But then 2 points of faint yellow light appeared in the gloom, blinking slowly. Eyes. They were set wide apart on a head he knew would be low and broad. The beast moved again, closer now. They could smell it. A musky, earthy odor mixed with the scent of rotting meat caught in its teeth. Mark made a sharp downward motion with his hand. "Stay down, stay silent." He lowered his rifle slowly, deliberately. Firing was not an option. The crack of the shot would echo for kilometers, a dinner bell for every other predator and the scalers. Noise would bring more trouble than it solved. Instead, he became part of the landscape. He lowered his body into a crouch, making his silhouette smaller. He controlled his breathing, making it slow and shallow. He willed his heart to quiet its pounding in his ears. He was a rock, a tree. Nothing of interest. Aya mimicked him, pressing herself flatter against the boulder, her face turned away. Her knowledge was instinctual, the inherited wisdom of a people who lived with these dangers. She knew not to run, not to scream, to become still and hope to be overlooked. The Thunderfoot took another step. The ground trembled. They could hear its deep, snuffling breaths as it sampled the air. The glowing eyes swept over their position. They passed over Mark, over the boulder, then swung back. It paused. The rumbling in its chest grew louder. A question. Mark didn't move a muscle. He didn't even blink. He met its gaze, not with challenge, but with emptiness. He was nothing, a void. After a long moment that stretched into an eternity, the eyes turned away. The heavy footfalls started again, moving off to their left, crunching through the forest. The sound grew gradually softer, swallowed by the distance and the night. The deep growl faded to a murmur, then to silence. They remained frozen for a full minute after the last sound disappeared. The normal night noises of the forest hesitantly began to return. A cautious chirp, a rustle in the leaves. Mark finally straightened up, his joints protesting. He offered a hand to Aya and pulled her to her feet. Her hand was cold in his. No words were exchanged. They just stood for a moment, 2 small figures in a vast, dangerous dark. The shared silence between them louder than any conversation. They had passed the test. The path ahead was still there, waiting. The forest ended abruptly. One moment they were pushing through thick, thorny undergrowth. The next they stood at the edge of a wide clearing. The ground was a carpet of crimson. Thousands of flowers, each one the size of a human hand, bloomed in perfect, unsettling unison. Their petals were a deep, blood-red velvet, and they gave off a thick, sweet scent that hung heavy in the still air. It was a cloying smell, like overripe fruit left to rot in the sun. It coated the back of the throat. Aya stopped, her eyes wide. The sheer unnatural beauty of the place was a stark contrast to the grim forest. A small smile touched her lips, the first since the river crossing. Her natural curiosity, the instinct of a child seeing something new and vibrant, overrode caution. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward the nearest perfect bloom. Her fingers were inches from the soft-looking petals. Mark's recognition was a cold spike of adrenaline. The colony logs had entries on this. Vivid red flora, a scent designed to attract, not repel. He'd read the reports of scouts who never returned from patrols in certain sectors. He started to speak, a sharp warning forming on his lips. "Aya, don't—" It was a second too late. Her fingers brushed the flower's center. The bloom didn't just release pollen. It puffed it outward in a concentrated cloud of fine orange dust. It enveloped her face and hand in a fragrant mist. She inhaled sharply, a reflexive gasp that drew the particles deep into her lungs. The effect was immediate. Aya's eyes lost their focus. She blinked rapidly, taking a stumbling step backward. The world around her began to warp. The solid ground beneath her feet felt like shifting sand. The colors of the forest bled into each other, the greens and browns smearing like wet paint. The hum of insects distorted into a high-pitched, screeching whine that grated against her ears. The world was melting, losing its shape and meaning. She cried out, a raw sound of pure terror. She wasn't seeing the clearing anymore. She saw the trees twist into monstrous, multi-limbed giants, their branches reaching for her with clawed tips. The crimson flowers became pools of bubbling blood. The sky above cracked open, a jagged tear of blackness through which terrible, unblinking eyes stared down. She saw scaled hands grabbing for her, heard her mother's scream echo from 1,000 directions at once. She was falling into a nightmare, Mark fought the same disorientation. The edges of his vision swam, a dizzying nausea rising in his gut. The sweet air was a poison in his lungs. But he'd been trained for chemical agents, for altered states. He shoved the rising panic down, locking it away. He needed an anchor, a fixed point in the swirling chaos. He grabbed the first solid memory his mind could find. Earth. Not the colony, not this death world, but the blue and green marble from the history files. Home. He moved through the thick, syrup-like air and gripped Aya's shoulders. Her small body was rigid with fear, thrashing against unseen monsters. He held her firm, his voice cutting through the auditory hallucinations, a low, steady rock in the mad tide. "Look at me," he said, his tone even, commanding. "Listen, the sky's blue. Not that blue, like the deep water in the colony's old films. The fields are green, a green so bright it almost hurts your eyes. The grass grows soft under your feet. You can hear birds. Real birds. Not these sounds. The air smells like rain on dry soil, clean. Nothing sweet. Just clean." He painted the picture with simple, concrete words. He described the sun, a single, gentle star, not the fractured light show blazing above them. He spoke of open spaces, of safety, of a world that made sense. He gave her a narrative to cling to, a thread of reality to pull herself back along. He was her protector, not just from physical threats, but from the terror inside her own mind. Slowly, the screaming in her ears faded to a ring, then to the forest's normal hum. The bleeding colors sharpened, resolving back into distinct trees and sky. The grasping monsters dissolved into stationary trunks and branches. The ground solidified under her feet. The world snapped back into focus, sharp and clear and dangerously real. The visions were gone. They stood panting in the silent, beautiful, deadly clearing. He kept his hands on her shoulders until her trembling stopped. The entrance was a jagged tear in the mountain's face, a wound in the black rock, shadowed and dark. The approach was a narrow ledge littered with loose shale that clattered with every cautious step. It was guarded, but the guards were gone. 2 crude wooden spears leaned against the rock wall, abandoned. The silence was heavy, complete. It was the kind of quiet that felt watchful, a trap waiting to be sprung. Bones adorned the entrance. They were not scattered. They were placed, arranged with deliberate purpose. An arch of interlocked rib cages formed a gateway. Skulls of large, unidentifiable animals were stacked in neat pyramids on either side. They were warnings. Not the random debris of a predator's den, but a message. This place was marked. It was a statement carved in bone, telling the foolish and the curious to turn back. This was not a place for the unwelcome. The air inside shifted. The dry, cold wind of the mountains was cut off. The new air was cool and carried the scent of damp stone and strange herbs. It was an earthy smell, mixed with the sharp, aromatic tang of plants crushed underfoot. The light changed next. The gray daylight faded, replaced by a flickering red glow. It came from clusters of bioluminescent fungi that clung to the ceiling and walls. Their light was unstable, pulsing softly, casting long, dancing shadows that made the stone walls seem to breathe and move. The cave opened into a larger chamber. The floor was smoothed by time and use. In niches carved into the walls, primitive altars held offerings. Some held the skulls of sharp-toothed predators, their empty eye sockets staring into the gloom. Others held pieces of strange technology, a cracked tablet screen, a handful of corroded bolts, a single pristine power cell, placed with reverence beside a carefully arranged stack of smooth river stones. This was not just a hideout. It was a sanctum, a place where ritual and belief were as important as food and shelter. The tribe that lived here used these practices to make sense of a harsh and unforgiving world. Mark moved like the ghost they named him for. He became a shadow among the flickering shadows. His boots made no sound on the stone. He kept to the perimeter of the chamber, using the uneven rock face for cover. His eyes scanned the space, taking in the details. The Scalers were a native tribe, isolated and desperate. Their culture was centered on these caves, a network of geothermal tunnels that offered refuge from Xantos's brutal climate. They used ritual and intimidation to survive, to bind their community together against the threats outside. They were not monsters. They were survivors just like him, clinging to their own ways in the dark. His gaze swept across the central space, past the altars and the silent, empty fire pit, and then he saw it. The central altar, a large flat stone worn smooth by time and use. And on that stone, held by thick ropes of woven vine, was a woman. Her head was bowed, her dark hair falling over her face. But her posture wasn't one of defeat. It was one of tense, waiting readiness. This was Aya's mother, the healer. The reason they had come. The ghost had found his objective. Now he had to figure out how to extract her from the heart of the serpent's den. The woman on the altar was not broken. She was defiant. Her head was up, her back straight against the rough stone. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, found marks across the shadowed cavern. They held no plea, only a sharp, assessing look. A calculation. She was taking his measure just as he was taking hers. This was Aya's mother, the healer, Sarah. A woman taken against her will, but one who had not surrendered her will. She was surrounded by scalers. A dozen of them stood in a loose, watchful circle, their three-eyed gaze shifting between the bound woman and a large pallet of furs on the cave floor. On the pallet lay their chieftain, a massive scaled figure racked by violent tremors. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps that echoed softly in the chamber. A sheen of sweat glistened on his brow under the pulsing red light. He was dying. They hadn't taken Sarah to harm her. They had kidnapped her for the one thing she possessed that they desperately needed. Her knowledge she was trying to save him. Mark saw it now. A crude paste of mashed herbs stained her fingertips a deep green. A clay bowl sat beside her on the altar, its contents giving off a sharp medicinal smell. She was working, even bound, using a blend of native botany and whatever half-remembered human science she had learned from the colony before its fall. Her movements were precise, focused. This was not execution. It was a desperate medical procedure. The scalers watched her with a tense, fearful respect. They did not see an enemy. They saw their only hope. Their chieftain's survival was paramount to the tribe's existence. Their culture, like many tribal societies, centered on the healer as a vital figure, responsible for the community's physical and spiritual well-being. Her expertise, passed down and honed, was indispensable. Their desperation was a tangible force in the cave, a thick tension in the air. It made them incredibly dangerous. A cornered animal is never more lethal than when it is fighting for its life, and they were fighting for their leaders. Mark understood the tragic irony in a single, cold moment. The sickness, the chieftain's tremors, the labored, wet breathing. He had seen it before, in the colony corridors, in the medical bay, in his own wife's eyes. This was no native plague. The virus that had wiped out Hope Colony was here. The gray sleep had found a new host. The scalers, in their desperation, had captured a healer to cure their chief of the very thing that had made Mark a ghost. They weren't the enemy. The sickness was the enemy. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was an intervention. He was here to stop a tragedy he had already lived through from happening again. The scope of his purpose shifted, widening from one woman's freedom to the containment of a catastrophe. The wreck was a tomb, but it held answers. Mark pushed aside a twisted section of bulkhead, the metal groaning in protest. The stench of old death was here too, mingled with ozone and cold rot. Bones lay scattered amidst the debris, some still clad in the faded gray fabric of a flight suit. He moved with a grim focus, his eyes scanning for anything that still held power, anything that could speak. The ship's logs were fragmented, their data corrupted by the crash and a decade of neglect. But the story they told was clear enough. It was a story of failure on a scale he hadn't imagined. Earth had sent missions, not just one. The logs hinted at multiple attempts, a string of ships cast into the void like stones into a dark well. All of them had lost contact. The silence from Earth wasn't a choice. It was a symptom. He found the command console, its screen spiderwebbed with cracks. He rerouted emergency power from a dying cell, his fingers moving on instinct. The screen flickered, then glowed with a sickly green light. Text scrolled, a final message stuck on a loop. The words were a cold hand closing around his heart. Rescue mission horizon to Hope Colony. A pause. Then the chilling follow-up. We have lost contact with Earth. The virus wasn't a planetary tragedy anymore. It was a galactic one. The rescue ship hadn't just found a dead colony. It had brought the plague with it or found it waiting. The disaster wasn't contained. It was spreading. Humanity wasn't just gone on Xantos. It was scattered across stars, dying in isolated pockets, utterly unaware that others were suffering the same silent fate. Each ship was a seed of death, carrying the blight to new worlds. The ship's original mission was rescue. Its cargo, still locked in shattered containers, was meant to be hope. Medical supplies, antivirals, blood plasma expanders, tools for saving lives now rusting in the dark. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. They had come to give aid, and had instead become a vector for the very thing they sought to cure. This changed everything. His 10-year mission of solitary survival was a small, selfish thing now. His personal grief was a single drop in an ocean of loss. The virus was an interstellar pandemic, a fire jumping from world to world. His purpose wasn't to hide from it anymore. It was to stop it, to contain it, to use the knowledge he carried, the immunity in his veins, to prevent another Hope colony, another crashed rescue ship, another planet of bones. He wasn't a ghost haunting a graveyard. That was a small story for a small tragedy. The scope was vast now, stretching across light years of silent space. He looked at the broken console, at the final looping plea for a home that might not even exist anymore. He was a man with a skill set. He was a man with the immunity. He was a man standing at the epicenter of a catastrophe with the tools to maybe, just maybe, build a dam against the flood. He wasn't a ghost. He was a beacon, a single point of light in an overwhelming dark. His war was no longer for a memory. It was for a future. He turned from the wreckage, the weight on his shoulders different now. Heavier, but also clearer. The path was set. Sarah's hands were stained a deep green from the crushed herbs smeared with the chief's dark blood. She worked with a focused intensity, her movements quick and sure even in the dim, pulsing light of the cave. She had studied the sick man for days, watching the fever take him, listening to the wet rattle in his chest. She knew the signs. The Scalar's traditional methods, their poultices and chants, were failing. The sickness was too strong, too alien, but she saw a connection now, a thread of hope. Her eyes lifted from the chieftain's shivering form to find Mark. He stood like a statue by the cave wall, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the tribesmen who watched them with a mixture of fear and hostility. She saw in him what the colony logs had hinted at, the sole survivor, the one who walked through the fire and did not burn. "If you survived exposure," she said, her voice low but clear in the tense silence, "your body developed defenses against the virus. Those defenses might be transferred through blood." Her idea was ancient, a treatment from Earth's own history books, a rudimentary form of convalescent plasma therapy. It was a simple, brutal logic. The antibodies in his blood, the things that fought off the gray sleep, could be given to another. They could act as a temporary shield, giving the chieftain's own system a fighting chance. It was a bridge between the advanced science of a dead colony and the desperate need of a native tribe. It was their only chance. The risk was immense. Drawing his blood here in this cave with crude tools and no sterile field could weaken him at a critical moment. Infection was a real threat. Blood loss could make him sluggish, less able to fight if the fragile truce shattered, and it meant giving a part of himself, the very source of his survival, to the people he had viewed as enemies just hours before. He would be sharing his singular advantage, the thing that had kept him alive and separate for a decade, with those who had threatened a child and taken a woman captive. The Scalars watched, their earlier aggression gone. Their three-eyed stares were no longer filled with the promise of violence, but with a desperate, silent plea. They saw their leader dying. They saw the ghost who had fought like a demon. They saw the healer with a possible answer. Their hostility was replaced by a raw, palpable need. They were cornered animals, but now they were looking for a handout, not a fight. The choice landed on Mark's shoulders with a familiar heavy weight. It was a different kind of calculation, not of tactics, but of ethics. He could keep his cure to himself. He could preserve his own strength, maintain the advantage his immunity gave him. He could walk away from this cave and its problems, returning to his silent, solitary war against the virus. Or he could give it. He could risk himself for a scaly chieftain he didn't know, for a tribe that had been his enemy. He could offer a piece of his own survival to save another life. The blood in his veins was the last legacy of Hope Colony. He had to decide if it was a treasure to be hoarded or a tool to be used. The choice was his. Isolate his cure or share it. Mark rolled up his sleeve. The decision was final, a simple motion that carried the weight of 10 years of solitude. He laid his forearm on the flat surface of the altar stone. The skin was pale, crisscrossed with the thin white lines of old scars. A map of his survival. Sarah produced the tools, not the sterile, precision instruments of the colony med bay, but a sharpened sliver of bone, its edge honed to a fine point. and a clean glass flask scavenged from the wreckage of the human ship. The procedure was crude, a brutal echo of the advanced medicine it attempted to mimic. It was the best they had. The only thing they had. The sharpened bone bit into the skin of his inner elbow. A quick, precise cut. The pain was a sharp, clean line, nothing compared to the deeper aches he carried. His blood, dark and vital, welled up immediately. It flowed into the flask, a slow, steady pulse of deep red. This was the carrier of his survival, the essence of his immunity, the thing that had set him apart and kept him alone for a decade. Now it was leaving his body, drop by drop, for a stranger, for an enemy. He watched, his expression unreadable, as Sarah took the filled flask. She didn't hesitate. She went to the pallet where the scalar chieftain lay shivering, his massive frame racked by the fever. She administered the blood with the same focused care she had used with her herbs. There was no ceremony, just a desperate act of hope in a dark cave. Then came the silence, a breathless, waiting quiet that filled the cavern. The scalars watched, their three eyes fixed on their leader. Mark stood by the wall, his sleeve still rolled up, a small piece of cloth pressed against the cut on his arm. He felt a slight lightheadedness, a distant hum of fatigue, the physical cost of the gift. There was no instant miracle, no sudden revival, only the slow, torturous passage of time. The chieftain's harsh, ragged breathing continued. His tremors shook the furs he lay on. Hours passed. The red fungi on the walls pulsed their slow, steady rhythm. The silence stretched thick with doubt. Then a change, a subtle shift. The violent shudders that had racked the chief's body began to lessen. Their intensity faded from a constant earthquake to a series of faint shivers. The awful wet sound in his chest softened. His breathing, once shallow and frantic, deepened. It steadied into a slower, more regular rhythm. The terrible tension in his scaled features eased. His three eyes flickered open. They were clouded with confusion, but the glaze of fever was gone. They focused slowly on the faces looking down at him. He took a long, clear breath. It was the first clean breath he'd drawn in days. It was working. The primitive gamble was paying off. A fragile, tentative hope sparked in the dark cave, a single point of light in the overwhelming dark. The antibodies in Mark's blood, the defenders forged in the fire of the colony's death, were fighting the battle his own body could not. Mark's reasoning was not complex. It was a soldier's logic stripped bare. The virus was the enemy. It did not care about human or scalar. It only cared about hosts. It was a shared threat, and a shared threat demanded a shared solution. His 10-year mission of personal survival was a failed strategy against an enemy this vast. His purpose had to shift. It was no longer about preserving one life, his own. It was about the preservation of life, any life that could stand against the darkness. To fight the fire, you had to use every tool, even the ones you carried in your own veins. Even if it meant giving a part of yourself to those you once called enemy, the ghost had given them a part of himself. The one thing he had kept sacrosanct. His separation was broken. His quarantine was over. He was no longer alone in his fight. The dynamic in the cave changed. The air was no longer sharp with the threat of violence. It was heavy with a fragile, watchful collaboration. Mark and Sarah worked in a space that was not quite a partnership. Not yet. Mark laid out the salvage tech from his pack. A portable scanner with a flickering screen. A power cell salvaged from the wreck. Tools for seeing the invisible. Sarah arranged her herbs and pastes on a flat stone, her hands moving with the knowledge of generations. It was a strange sight. The hard edges of colony technology next to the soft textures of native botany. Two different ways of knowing the world, laid out side by side on a cave floor. The scalars watched from a distance. They kept their spears close, their three eyes wary. But their hostility was muted. Their chieftain's slow, steady improvement was a fact that commanded a grudging respect. The ghost's violent fury was one thing. His willingness to give his own blood to save their leader was another. They didn't understand it, but they couldn't ignore it. They watched the two healers, one from the stars and one from the river, and waited. Mark made a decision. He left the cave and returned to his shelter alone. He moved through the ruins with a new purpose, his senses alert but his mind focused. He went to a sealed locker, its lock stiff with disuse. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the medical journal. It was a thick bound book from Hope Colony, its pages filled with the precise handwriting of doctors long dead. It contained theories on the gray sleep, notes on immune response, diagrams of containment protocols. It was a relic from a dead world. He carried it back to the caves, its weight more than just paper. He found Sarah tending to the chief. He didn't speak. He simply held the book out to her. She looked from his face to the journal, her expression unreadable. Then she took it. Her fingers traced the embossed symbol on the cover, the stylized caduceus of the colony medical corps. It was more than a book. It was a trust. A passing of the torch from one world to the next. It represented a synthesis, her knowledge of Xanthos's plants and his knowledge of human disease. Combined, they might find a real answer. Aya watched them from the entrance to the side cavern. She had been quiet since they entered the mountain, a small shadow in the flickering light, but now a quiet smile touched her lips. She saw the two adults, one human, one alien, working not in opposition but in a strange new harmony. She saw the journal in her mother's hands. She saw the future beginning to form, a fragile possibility built from shared need and hard-won trust. Mark turned to the scalar leader. The chieftain Va was propped up on his pallet, his breathing clearer, his eyes sharp. Mark didn't speak to him as an enemy. He spoke to him as a man whose people were dying. He spoke of the virus, of its spread, of the crashed ship and the lost missions. He spoke of a common foe that did not care about scales or skin. Va listened, his head tilted. He looked at the human who had fought him, then bled for him. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. The alliance was not sealed with a handshake. It was sealed with a shared look of grim understanding. Will the silent ghost finally find a reason to rejoin the living world? His actions gave the answer. Giving his blood, sharing his knowledge, forming an alliance with former enemies. These were not the acts of a man clinging to isolation. They were the first hesitant steps of a man finding a new purpose in connection. His war was no longer a private one. It was a shared burden. The silent ghost was not just rejoining the world. He was building a bridge to a new one. The plan became more than a simple extraction. It was a full mission now, a defined set of objectives that stretched beyond the cave and the mountain. The immediate goal was a return to the metal bird. They would salvage every ounce of medicine from its broken hull. They would pry its data logs from the dead consoles, downloading every byte of information on the virus, on Earth's failed rescue attempts, on anything that could help them understand the enemy they faced. The supplies were critical. The data was their only map. The journey back to the wreck would be harder. They were no longer a ghost and a child moving fast and silent through the wilds. They would be a group. Sarah, Aya, a contingent of scalers. Their strength needed to carry the salvaged goods, but their presence a complication. More people meant more noise. More scent on the wind, more chances for a predator attack or a misstep in hostile terrain. The risk factor multiplied with every additional member. The path they had taken days to traverse would now be a slow, cautious caravan, carrying the hopes of two tribes. But the goal was clear. It was no longer about saving one person. It was about preventing the gray sleep from consuming another tribe, another world. The crashed ship had redefined the battlefield. The virus was not a localized tragedy. It was a contagion with interstellar reach. Their mission was containment. It was defense on a planetary scale. Every vial of medicine, every line of code recovered, was a weapon against the darkness. Mark would lead them. He stood looking at the assembled group. Aya, her small hand holding her mother's. Sarah, her face set with a healer's resolve. The scalers, their spears in hand, their three eyes watching him, waiting for direction. He was not their ghost anymore. He was not a myth. He was a guide. He was the only one who knew the terrain, the threats, the way back to the wreck. His military training, long buried under grief, resurfaced. Threat assessment, resource allocation, route planning. The skills were there, rusty but functional. He would use them. He had a tribe again. It was a fragile thing, an unlikely alliance built on desperation and a shared enemy. A human ghost, a river healer, her daughter, and a clan of scaled warriors. It was held together by the thinnest thread of trust, spun from his donated blood and their dying chieftain's steady breath. It was a necessary tribe, the only kind that could possibly survive what was coming. His daughter Eliza was still gone. His wife Sarah was still gone. Their memories were a permanent ache in his chest, a cold space that would never truly warm. But he was here. His body bore the scars of survival. His blood carried the weapon against the plague. His mind held the maps and the strategies. To honor their memory by hiding in the ruins was an empty gesture. To honor them by fighting for the living, by protecting other daughters and other families, that was a purpose. That was a war worth fighting. His decision to stay to lead this ragged band back into danger was his answer. The silent ghost was done with silence. He would rejoin the living world not as the man he was, but as the man the crisis demanded. He would build a new community from the ashes of the old, a pact between the river tribe and the scalers against the common foe. He would use every skill, every shred of knowledge, every last ounce of his strength to ensure that the story of Xantos did not end the way the story of Hope Colony did. The ghost had found his voice, and his war had just begun. Weeks later, Mark stood at the edge of the river tribe's village. The air was different here. It smelled of wood smoke and cooking fish, not rust and decay. The salvaged medical supplies from the wreck were distributed, a careful process overseen by Sarah and the tribe's elders. The antivirals were locked in a cooled storage hut, a precious cache against the future. The data from the ship's logs was being studied, its fragments of information pored over by a small team. It was slow work, like trying to read a book from ashes. The past was still a shadow at his back. He felt it in the quiet moments, a cold space where memory lived. The future was a map with most of its details missing, a journey into unknown territory. The threat of the virus was not gone. The Scaler's chieftain was recovering, but the pathogen was still out there, a hunter waiting for a new opening. The work was constant. The danger was real, but the work was good. It had a clear purpose. Repairing a shelter, setting a perimeter watch, teaching a Scalar scout how to identify contaminated water sources. Each task was a brick in a wall against the darkness. It was a different kind of survival. Not just enduring, but building. He was using his skills for something more than his next meal. Aya ran up to him. Her steps were light on the packed earth. She was laughing, a clean, bright sound that cut through the low murmur of the village. The dirt was gone from her face. Her torn tunic was replaced by a clean one, woven from river reeds. She was no longer the girl pleading with a ghost at the edge of the ruins. She was a child safe. Her fear was a memory, not a constant companion. She skidded to a stop in front of him, her smile wide and unguarded. Sarah stood nearby, watching them. She held a data slate in one hand, her fingers resting on the screen. Her expression was calm. Her smile was smaller than her daughter's, a quiet understanding in her eyes. She saw the change in him. She saw the weight he carried, and she saw him finally setting it down piece by piece. She didn't speak. She just watched, a silent witness to a quiet miracle. Mark felt a strange sensation at the corner of his mouth, a tightness, a pull. It was an unfamiliar muscular contraction, one he hadn't employed in a decade. His face felt stiff, unpracticed. It was a hesitant movement, a foreign signal his body was struggling to remember. It was a smile. It felt alien on his face, like trying on an old uniform that no longer fit. But it was real. It was a response to the laughter, to the safety, to the simple good work of the day. This smile was the final silent testament. It was not a denial of his grief. That loss was a part of him, a permanent scar, but it was a grief acknowledged and finally placed on a shelf, its weight no longer all-consuming. It was proof that the wound could finally close around the edges, leaving room for something else. The silent ghost, who had lived for 10 years in a monument of solitude, had found a reason to rejoin the living world. The sound of his own name spoken aloud had been the first crack. The shared mission had been the path. This smile, small and hesitant, was the destination. He was not a visitor here. He was not a myth. He was home. Mark's journey proves a deep isolation can be shattered by a simple act of compassion. His greatest survival skill wasn't living alone, but remembering how to live for others. The mission isn't over. A new watch begins. The story continues as he leads his fragile alliance, a quiet guardian against the long dark. The dead walk beside us, not behind us, Sarah said. They want to accompany us into light. His war is no longer private. It is shared. His purpose is rebuilt, not from solitude, but from the strength found in connection.